the way that we speak to ourselves in our own head every single day, like we could never, ever speak to another human being like that. And yet we allow ourselves to do it to ourselves every day. So in my opinion, having done this many, many times and worked with many, many business owners through this process, the biggest thing is fear.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry. But you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klink.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klink, and I'm really excited about today's show, which is actually going to be kind of a meta show because we're going to be talking about podcasting and using a podcast to build your business. So yeah, you're about to listen to a podcast about the value of podcasting and be hearing from two people who both have podcasts. So it's going to be an interesting show. So don't worry, you're not going to be relying on me to provide you the expertise here. I've got an awesome guest for today's show. Today's guest expert is Stephen Woessner. Now, Stephen is the founder and CEO of Predictive ROI, a digital marketing agency, and he's the host of Onward Nation, a top-rated daily podcast for learning how today's top business owners think, act, and achieve. Onward Nation is listened to in 120 countries around the world. I highly recommend that you check out Onward Nation, and I would especially recommend episode number 498 to you. Stephen had a really great guest on that show. I bet you can guess who I'm talking about. But since the advent of the commercial internet, Stephen has collected tens of thousands of data points that have given him the ability to identify what he calls the 8 money-draining mistakes and the 8 money-making opportunities. Darren Hardy, then publisher of Success Magazine, interviewed Stephen to discuss how business owners can identify and fix the mistakes. He is the author of 3 books, including the #1 bestseller, Profitable Podcasting, and his digital marketing insights have been featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur, The Washington Post, and Inc. magazine. Welcome to the Online Genius Podcast, Stephen.
Well, Bobby, thanks very much for the invitation. And in episode 498 of Onward Nation was a whole heck of a lot of fun. And I'm grateful that you accepted my invitation to join me on our show. You shared all kinds of insights and wisdom with respect to IP so that, our business owners, our listeners could get a lot smarter in that area and how to protect themselves. And I'm grateful for those lessons. Thank you, my friend.
Well, you are welcome. And it's funny in some ways. I think, I'm excited to talk podcasting with you. And I think I actually want to start right there because the fact that I was on your show and you're thanking me and I'm thanking you in some sense shows part of the value of having a podcast, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does because your podcast, if you're really strategic about it, can help you develop relationships at a number of different levels and certainly build your network and people that you know and experts in your space and tangentially, which Onward Nation has done for both of us and your podcast has done for you too. But then you can really get specific about how your podcast can drive business development. And when I say podcast, I should really kind of maybe broaden that a little bit more because, really what we're talking about is how a podcast can become essentially the hub of your content creation. And is it an audio file that plays on iTunes? Sure it is. But that's really just the initial step. That's kind of like the bare minimum of what we're seeing in helping business owners take advantage of now with the trends in long form audio. So can it help you develop relationships? Yes, obviously you're proof of that. I'm proof of that. But then it can really drive biz dev.
Yeah, and I love the business building or relationship building aspect of it because it's perfect for me, quite honestly, because even though I love talking to people, I'm a trial lawyer by training, naturally I'm an introvert. If you put me into a networking event, I'm horrible because I stand in the corner and don't talk to anybody. But being on podcasts and having people on my podcast creates a natural place for me to have these wonderful conversations, build relationships. And so I think that's kind of a point that a lot of people need to think about is it's a wonderful way to network without having to go to networking events, which I don't know about. Do you even enjoy going to networking events, Stephen?
No, this might sound weird, but because I don't like chit chat. I don't like small talk. And my wife teases me is like when she sees me get stuck into like a a chit chat, small talk kind of conversation. She knows it's just driving me bananas. And the reason being is because it's very surface level. Like I love conversations, with people, but I like to get the meat of it. I like to learn from them, learn from their experiences and that kind of stuff. So typically like networking events and those types of things, I don't mean to sound negative, but typically they're exchange a business card. Where are you from? What do you do? This and that. And there's no real depth to it. Whereas a podcast where you're learning about Bobby and you're asking him questions, or you're learning about Sarah and asking her about her path and journey, that's really interesting. And I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a different kind of a conversation, but I think this series of questions and answers actually leads me, I think, to a really important question. And that's, I know the answer to this, that podcasts aren't for everyone. But in your view, what are kind of some of the personality traits that someone needs to be a successful podcast host?
Excellent question. And I think it's several things that really make a host a great host. And one of those is just a natural curiosity to really understand a situation, really understand somebody's point of view, really understand their path and journey, what brought them to this point. And so having that natural curiosity about your guest, I think, is really important. The second thing is realizing that your guest is a star and you as a host of your own show, you're not. And I've seen a lot of hosts kind of struggle with that. And the reason being is because the guest is there to not complement your expertise, but the guest is there to share their expertise and their thoughts and their wisdom. And because you can do that without a guest, you can do solo casts, your audience will love you for that. But when you're with a guest, you're there to try to pull the best out of whatever he or she has and be the conduit to pass it on to your audience. And then in doing that, you need to be able to think like your audience. A great host is able to sit there and think about what that guest is sharing and then think, what would my audience, what my listeners want me to ask next? Because you never want your listener to be thinking, as they're walking on a treadmill or whatever, be thinking, oh, Bobby asked this question, and then you never ask the question, right? So being able to anticipate what your audience wants you to ask. So those three things are, and then also when your guest is, sharing particular thoughts and wisdom, being able to reflect that back and say, did I really understand that? Is there something else there? So those are maybe four kind of the big highlights that I've seen.
So I think that's all great advice. And as a guest on podcasts, I've been on podcasts where the host did not have some of those qualities. And I can tell you it's not entertaining for the guest and probably not for the listener. But let me ask you this. Is there kind of a personality type? People think I'm an extrovert or I'm an introvert or I have this quality or that. Is there anything beyond those characteristics you talk about, which some of them are learnable? I mean, I think you can figure out a lot of that other than this natural curiosity. But does a podcast work for someone who's an extrovert or someone has ADD, or are there certain types of people who you would just say, no, I think maybe you should not go this route?
Yeah. Okay. So good question. And I've done a lot of study in the area of personality, specifically in Myers-Briggs and where somebody gets their energy level, because you've mentioned introversion and extroversion. And actually, I don't think that's an indicator or a marker of success. And because I've seen, extreme extroverts and I've seen extreme introverts either be good or bad at being a good host, about, actually having the skill that is necessary. So I think it extends beyond personality. For example, one of our greatest guests on Onward Nation, his name is David Mattson, and he's the CEO of Sandler Training. And he says, Stephen, I happen to be one of the highest scoring introverts in Myers-Briggs, but he's an exceptional salesperson. He's an incredible CEO, and he's a great podcast guest. I happen to score a perfect 21 out of 21 for introversion on Myers-Briggs. I have zero bones in my body that lend to extroversion, zero. But again, so it's not about sort of introversion and extroversion, where we draw our energy. Are we more social or not social? I really do think it is about somebody's ability to really be curious, to really ask great questions, to be comfortable in doing so. And if they don't have that skill set, then you're right. I think podcasting is probably not the right medium for them. And maybe they ought to try, writing or research or something else that doesn't involve, the skill set that podcasting requires.
I think that's great advice. And I think it actually does fit with what I know of people whose shows I've been on and a sense of what I get of who are good hosts and not good hosts. So I think that's great. But now I want to actually move to really talking in depth about the benefits of podcasting. And in your book, I love that you refer to podcasting as a Trojan horse of selling. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Is one of the primary ways we love to see podcasting drive biz dev into, in this case, a host's core business. So if your listeners are thinking about having their own show, I would encourage them to think strategically about who are the dream 25 or the dream 50 prospects that you would really love to be doing business with. But for whatever reason, you just haven't received an at-bat yet. They might not even know who you are. They might be working with one of your competitors and are happy. There's a myriad of reasons why we haven't received an at-bat yet with our dream prospects. Make that list. And then orchestrate a show and curriculum and content around what would be attractive to those dream 25 or dream 50. And then you invite your best prospects to be your guests on the show. Now, I am not suggesting that after the interview, you start pitching them to hire you and to engage you or to buy your whatever. What I am suggesting is that your podcast changes the game, because no longer are you a business owner looking for your next account. You're a journalist that represents a platform, that represents an audience. And so then they say yes and accept your invitation to be a guest on your show. And then downstream, because you've had an opportunity to demonstrate your smarts, you've had an opportunity to really demonstrate some hospitality, set your ego aside and interview them, pull their best and brightest wisdom and insights and share that with your audience. And then downstream, because that door has now been open, you can share more content with them to demonstrate what it is that you do for other clients that you serve really well. And then, lo and behold, every time they turn around with a question, there's Bobby being helpful. And so next time they need something that Bobby has, they're going to give Bobby a call. And then Bobby can also be even more proactive and reach back out to Stephen and say, hey, you know what? When we sat down and had that interview, by the way, thanks very much. Really enjoyed the conversation. You mentioned X. And gosh, that made me and my partners here at our firm think about Y. And you know what? We do Y really well. Is there a day or time next week that we can sit down and chat about that? And then Stephen says, sure, be happy to sit down and chat with you about that, because I had a great experience as a guest on your show. And now the podcast has served as the Trojan horse of sales, because the door is open and the conversation could be had. But through that entire process, I never felt like a prospect, and that's critical.
What I'm hearing you say is that having a podcast, aside from the benefits it has with building reputation and building a rapport with your listeners, gives you a wonderful way to get to the point that prospects know, like, and trust you by you having them on the show. Is that basically what it's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it opens the door because you're setting your salesperson or business owner hat aside, and you're now a journalist. And so, the gatekeeper that would normally block you or shunt you or stop you cold in your tracks is now taking your podcast and moving that past the city gates right into the C-suite. And now you have access to people who you wouldn't normally have. And so gaining the access is really critical. And that's the Trojan horse element. And then once you have that, you have to be able to demonstrate your smarts and wit and experience and in the right way so that you can do the know, like, and trust, like you just mentioned, because that obviously is huge value.
So I think a lot of people don't think about this aspect of a podcast. And I think it's fantastic that you use that as the lead benefit. But, are there ways that people can make money or get a return on their investment in podcasting other than ultimately doing business or getting their guests as clients?
Yeah. In fact, we get that question quite often where somebody will say, look, I don't want to sell to my guests. I for whatever reason that makes me uncomfortable. It's not part of my model. There's a myriad of reasons, and very legitimate reasons, why somebody would not want to sell to their guests. And so then the next sort of monetization strategy that we use, if you will, is what we call the trident. And so there's 3 prongs to the trident. And so the first is you'd want to invite guests on your show who would provide you with the halo effect. Complementary thought leaders with potentially large audiences themselves. So if and when they are gracious enough to share your content, your episode, your interview with them through to their audience, your audience then grows, right? So there's sort of that transference of credibility and also the halo effect, and your audience grows. That's the first prong, if you will, in the trident. The second is that now that your audience has grown and gotten to a point of momentum and some scale, you may have something that you want to sell through to that audience. And that might be a course, that might be a product, that might be a service, that might be some sort of widget, whatever it might be. But now your audience is to the point and they've become fans enough of you that you can potentially sell through to your audience, not your guests, but your audience. That's the second prong in the trident. The third is that then potentially, because your content has become so valuable, you're selling through to an audience that loves you, then third parties may sit up and take notice and say, gosh, Bobby, what you're doing there really sounds special. And your audience is actually our audience. We'd like to sponsor what it is that you're doing. And so then, maybe it's a HubSpot, which has sponsored one of our clients' podcasts, or payroll processing company Paychecks, which has sponsored another one of our clients' podcasts. So a third-party brand may say, you're doing something great. We'd like to be able to buy access to your audience. Could we put our brand on your show or platform? And then potentially the answer is yes, or maybe it's no, depending upon if it's a good fit or not. So the trident of monetization is a great way to also drive revenue, just one of a number of different ways. If you don't want to sell through to your guests, trident might be a good way, a good next step.
I think that's a great process, or I guess a 3-step piece that you talk about with the trident, which basically is all about building audience and selling to that audience, which I think is fantastic. One other piece that I found, and I wonder if you've experienced this, is that it's a great way, and this, I guess, goes back to the networking effect. It goes back, and it's a way to really create relationships with, if you're in the online space, people who might be your affiliates, people who might introduce you to someone else who would then put you on a virtual summit and things like that. Do you find that those aspects tend to be useful and lead to good monetization for hosts?
I think that they could, for sure. And really what we're doing is scratching the surface, even though we've talked about a couple of, actually 3 now, because of what you just mentioned, 3 significant strategies for monetization. That even still just scratches the surface. For example, what if a business owner got really strategic about a book that they wanted to write, got really strategic about their table of contents, and then decided, why don't I record solo casts about each of these topics, transform that content, and now that's written a book, and I sell that book to a publisher, and it becomes a bestseller. I take that book and I cut that up into keynote topics, and now that launches me into a speaking career. That's a possibility. Getting really specific about a quarterly webinar program that they might want to be developing, be able to teach their curriculum and so forth, and letting the podcast, solo cast, create that curriculum that they then teach within webinars. That turns into a course, and then they sell that. Or maybe a collection of podcasts, maybe once somebody has done 200, 300, 400 episodes, they take that content, have it transcribed, codified, and now it becomes a research report that you present at conferences within associations, and maybe that's paid or unpaid, but you're in front of your best customers who can engage you for your professional services. There is a litany of ways that you can take this hub, this cornerstone piece of content that is your podcast, that can then slice and dice into both monetization and thought leadership that can really drive revenue, beyond even just courses. And not that that's insignificant. I'm just saying that is really the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I think that's all fantastic advice. And I know one thing I've seen people do is they take the best tips they've had guests on their shows give, and this isn't monetization so much, but they didn't put that together as a PDF lead magnet that they get leads with. So I think there are endless ways that people can extract value. And I think the way you said it, that we're just scratching the surface, is right on. But now I want to transition to what might stop people from launching a show. And what are some of the biggest obstacles that you find people face that stop them from moving forward and launching a podcast when they maybe should be pursuing that as part of their business?
Well, if they've listened to what you're suggesting with respect to personality, which I think was a great place to kind of start that conversation. And if they say, yep, check that off the list, I feel like I'm a good fit, I'm curious, I've got the right mental energy, I like to think like my listeners want me to think, and I'm bold enough to ask the right questions. If all of those are check, 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 then I think the next one, and this might sound a little bit silly or potentially surprising to your listeners, and that is the imposter syndrome. Yeah, I have worked with so many business owners over refining their content, refining their point of view, refining their message. And I will tell you, Bobby, without a shadow of a doubt, the biggest constraint to somebody moving forward is fear. It's fear that's built in around the imposter syndrome. It rears this ugly head of, well, I can't really say that. What will people think? Well, geez, that's a little bit bold. I think I need to dial it back a little bit. And they're afraid of the criticism. They hear the little voice sitting on their shoulder or whispering in their ear, and it's like, Bobby, who are you to dare to do something so amazing as that, or to challenge that, or to try to be successful there? Don't launch a show. Imagine the criticism that you could be opening yourself up to. What if people don't like it? What if people send you bad tweets? What if people hit you up on LinkedIn and then start making fun of you? Or what if they don't like the questions that you ask? The way that we speak to ourselves in our own head every single day, like we could never, ever speak to another human being like that. And yet we allow ourselves to do it to ourselves every day. So in my opinion, having done this many, many times and worked with, many, many business owners through this process, the biggest thing is fear. It's the imposter syndrome. Now, everybody may articulate it in a slightly different way because most people aren't bold enough to say, you know what, this scares the bejesus out of me and I'm afraid to move forward. I've heard all kinds of ways to sort of rephrase that. But at its core, it is fear.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And it's like you were reading my mind, because I can attest from my own personal experience. Even though I'm a Harvard Law School graduate, I worked at some fantastic firms, had some unbelievable mentors, and I've been doing this online entrepreneurship for, 3 years now. I had doubts. I said, well, who am I to, start doing this and start telling people this? So, it sounds like that is a common theme that you hear from people. Are there other obstacles that get in the way that really are easy to knock down that aren't about mindset for you?
Oh, sure. I mean, things like, oh, gosh. And this also sort of kind of dovetails from fear, but it's like, well, Stephen, I mean, who in the world would I invite to be on the show? Or, gosh, yes, I have, maybe a few friends who would say yes, but, I would really like to get this person or this person. How do I go about doing that? And so, we walk through the process of not letting the fact that you have a brand new show, create that fear or roadblock, and getting really strategic about the first 10 guests that you might ask, and who do those 10 guests know that they'd be happy to introduce you to. And then those dominoes lead to other dominoes. And pretty soon you have some momentum, you're in multiple countries, and you have a greater story to tell from an audience perspective. But oftentimes it can feel like, geez, nobody's going to say yes. Who's going to want to listen to this? And then realizing that, gosh, maybe I could put a strategy in place to where my guests are going to want to actually promote the episode that they were on if I do a really good job. And that helps me build audience. And so then I quickly get past that hurdle too. So I think once we get past the fear and we set that aside, and then we think, okay, who's the guest list going to be, whether they're prospects or not? And then how does that then build audience? And then we get past that hurdle. Well, then we're staring right at momentum. And that starts to feel really good.
Stephen, it's amazing. Evidently, I am your case study of problems, because that was my next big concern. And listeners, I can tell you that it just shouldn't be a concern. I've asked, I don't know the total number of people I've asked to be on the show, but I can tell you, no one has actually said no. I think I've had maybe 10% of the people I've asked just didn't respond. But so I've had 90% of the people that I've asked to be on the show gladly accept.
Nice.
So, I think if you're strategic about it, and, I think the advice you gave in there, Stephen, is perfect, that you do things like ask your guests, well, is there anyone else that you would recommend, and things like that, and start maybe with the people that you have relationships with, but who are a good fit for your audience. So I think that's fantastic advice. Now let's talk about another thing that I think a lot of people get nervous about. It didn't bother me, but a lot of people are nervous about is the tech side. Is it complicated to launch a podcast from a tech side?
Yeah, and of course I'm biased here, and it wasn't challenging for you. And the reality is that it can be for some. However, in an afternoon with our good old friend Google, we can get past those fears if we're truly committed to doing so. And really what we're talking about for tech nowadays is buying a nice microphone off of Amazon for a couple $100 and probably even less than that. Having a Zoom account, a paid Zoom account, which is what Bobby and I are using right now. And, he's got a great mic. I've got a good mic, and we're connecting through Zoom and recording that. And then being able to edit the audio if you want to do it yourself using something like Adobe Audition, which is part of the Adobe Creative Cloud, which costs about $30 a month, I believe, for the total package, which is relatively inexpensive. Now, Adobe Audition takes some figuring out, or you can find somebody, to edit the audio for you if you didn't want to DIY it. But there's a lot of different options. Either do it yourself, hire it out, build a core team. So don't let the tech become this kind of big, scary monster that sleeps under your bed, because it really isn't that complicated if you just sit down and are willing to do a couple hours worth of research and figure it out. It really is not that complicated.
Yeah, see, I am an overly analytical person, I think. See, I had taken John Lee Dumas's free podcast. I think I'd read 3 or 4 books about it, but that's just me. And I did that even though I knew I was going to hire out a lot of the work, just because, for me, I have a higher purpose that I can spend my time on. But I definitely got to the point. It's not that complicated. And I'll tell people exactly what Steven said. I've got a mic with a boom on it. I've got Zoom, and then I've got Audition. And I already had to have Creative Cloud because I want to have some of the other aspects of it. So I had that built in. So it's not a huge lift. Do you recommend, though, that people start out by investing in any kind of high quality, high level of stuff, or can they kind of take a bootstrap approach up front?
Are we talking about tech still?
Yeah,
right?
on the tech side generally.
Actually, no. So when clients are asking us about what should they invest in, it's in the hundreds of dollars of stuff, as far as the things we just talked about. In my opinion, what is more important than tech I mean, the stuff that Bobby just mentioned will get you 90 to 95% there as far as studio quality. If you spent thousands of dollars and built a studio or went to a studio and hired an audio engineer, is it going to sound better? Sure. Is it going to sound a lot better? I don't think so. I mean, it'll sound better. Where I think that it would make more sense, in my opinion, to invest your time and effort and energy is on why are you doing this in the first place, and on the strategy and how are you going to leverage the content to truly drive biz dev. That's where you should be putting your time, effort, and energy in working with partners and so forth, is really focused on the monetization, because anybody can, get a microphone and start yakking into it and put MP3 files on iTunes. That does not drive their business forward. So being strategic about how to build an audience, and then specifically how that drives biz dev, that's critical for success.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And actually, you led me right where I was going next, which is what are kind of the stages in launching or planning a show? And I'm gathering that the first place you need to start is with coming up with kind of just a strategic vision for first what the show is going to be, but also how it's going to fit into your overall business.
Yeah, exactly correct. And I've received some feedback, regarding profitable podcasting, the book that you had mentioned in the intro, and thank you for that. That it's more than a podcasting book. In fact, it's not a podcasting book at all. It's a business book. That the first half of the book is all about strategy, monetization, business development, and how this piece of cornerstone content, in this case a podcast, can really drive business into your core business, or biz dev into your core business, revenue, leads, all of that, and getting really strategic about it. So, taking you through your vital metrics checklist and really understanding, are you ready for leads? And I think that there's 39 different questions that I ask in a scoring system that I put into that process, giving you then a systems overview, giving you a detailed instruction game plan about revenue, how to then expand your platform beyond just a podcast, how to build your nation of true fans, going back to the trident of monetization, talking about your avatar for both your customers and then tying that into a $2 million mistake that I made so that you don't make the same mistake. So all of that framing is so important before we get into the tech, because then once we get into the tech, it's like, oh, now I understand the purpose as to why I'm doing that. So all of that strategy is very important on the front end. And then we've broken it down into 6 or 7 stages of the actual production process.
And I'm guessing a lot of the work you'll do in the production process, it's pretty easy once you figured out your strategic plan. For example, you'll be able to figure out who you want as guests, what kind of questions you want to ask them, and all of those kinds of things if you have a good vision for the podcast itself.
Exactly correct. I mean, and that's why we call this really cornerstone content, because, thinking of it from building a building perspective, the cornerstone is the first stone that is ever set, and every stone thereafter ties back to the positioning of the cornerstone. So it drives everything else for that entire building. And so this same thing, if you're building a podcast, if you're building a website, if you're building your business, no matter what perspective we're talking about here or what element we're talking about, that cornerstone is critical. So that foundational stone is important. So that's why I wrote the book the way that I did. I wanted to make sure that readers, that business owners went through a very structured process of strategy in business building first before we got into the mechanics of mics and question flow and scheduling systems and guest advocacy systems and reminders downstream and Infusionsoft campaigns and all of that. Because if we mess up the front, it doesn't matter what the back end is. I mean, it's going to be a train wreck.
Yeah, I think that's a fair to say. And since you said a train wreck, one question I did want to ask you, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen people make in either launching or running podcasts?
Well, so I mean, I think we've kind of talked about sort of the strategy. So of course, if we get the strategy wrong, everything else is, going to be messed up, downstream. And then I guess let's assume that they sort of get the strategy right and they sort of get the guests right. Then I think it's also kind of, not tied into their business, not tied into the value ladder, right? And so maybe that's actually kind of a miss in the strategy piece. But what I mean by that is, having a platform out there talking, trying to build an audience, but then not having really anything to sell and having no structure to that. I think Russell Brunson does a really good job from ClickFunnels of talking about the value ladder that, you mentioned kind of the lead magnet. Somebody opts in for that. Then do they move into a $99 thing? Then do they move into a $197 or a $997 thing? Then do they move on to like a $5,000 2-day on intensive where you're there in your office or their office? Then what, right? So I see that is oftentimes a big mistake. I'm super excited to have a podcast or whatever, but I have absolutely no idea what is it that I'm going to sell. That's a big miss. And so, because now we're not tying it into, the core business, and then leaving it at that, and then not recognizing that the revenue stream could be so much more than just those initial product offerings, because that content can be sliced and diced into many other pieces. So I think that business owners are leaving a lot of money on the table by not taking advantage of that.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I think a lot of people need to be thinking about that. And it does tie back in many ways to what we talked about at the beginning, which is you need to have a vision for how are you going to get a return on this. Another mistake that I hear a lot of people talk about, and I see it when I look at iTunes, is I think a lot of people think of a podcast as a get-rich-quick scheme, because you see so many shows that have 5 or 6 episodes and then nothing more. Realistically, what does someone need to expect in terms of how much time are they going to have to put in? How many shows are they going to need to put in before they really are going to start seeing a really good return and start seeing great numbers in terms of listeners and all of that?
We've certainly seen monetization happen faster than this, but I think you need to give it a solid year. I think the typical business owner needs to think to themselves, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm realistically going to give it everything I have for 12 months. So theoretically 50 plus episodes, 1 a week. Onward Nation monetized in the first 30 days of being live. We've had other clients monetize and get significant ROI 3 to 4 months in. And then we've seen some that took, closer to the year, depending upon their business model and so forth. A lot of it is driven by business model and less about the show, but the model. Sales cycle is longer, average conversion is very high as far as dollar value. And so there's a lot of business model things that can affect that. But ultimately, I say to clients when we're having conversations like this, because I get that question often, is I say, you really need to give this a solid 12 months and evaluating it along the way. And if you're not committed and if you're not willing to at least do that, then this is not likely the right platform for you. Because you're 100% correct, Bobby. It is not a get rich quick scheme. This is a business development strategy, in my opinion.
I think it's hilarious. And just for the listener's sake, though, even though you monetized Onward Nation within a month, that's the equivalent of most podcasts, 4 or 5 months, because you're doing 5 days a week versus once a week.
Sure,
So
fair point.
I think you do start to build up a lot more content, although I'm not sure that you get exactly there. But I do think that's great advice about a year, and that means I've got a ways to go till I hit that point. But I was always committed to this for the long term. Now, one thing I also like to ask people, I love reading. We talked about that. What are some resources other than your book, which I think people definitely should pick up, which is Profitable Podcasting? But other than that, what are some resources that you would suggest to people, listeners who might be thinking about investigating launching a podcast of their own?
I would suggest, doing some research on companies that are doing it well. And I think that NPR has a great host of shows. And in studying those shows from both a content perspective and then trying to sort of feel your way through how those shows, what the economic models are behind the shows. You mentioned John Lee Dumas. John's a friend of mine. He's an incredible resource and has done extremely well for himself with Entrepreneur on Fire. I think it's a fantastic platform. And I think the monetization, behind it is brilliant. And I think he's done a really, really good job. And he's very transparent. He and Pat Flynn, I think, are some of the most transparent people with their numbers and this and that. They are a great, series of case studies. As is Tim Ferriss, and watching what he's doing, he's also very transparent, about what he's done really well. So I think that you could certainly go and look at others who are doing it well, and then get really strategic about slicing apart what they've done well from both a content perspective and then from revenue perspective, and then to start to see, well, am I comfortable with that? Could I pull that off talent wise? Does that make me feel a little bit squeamish? If not, great. Then I'm going to pull this piece, this piece, this piece. And now I'm starting to build kind of a file folder of things that I like. And then also go into your industry and see, are there competitors of yours who are doing this well? And if so, are there things that you can learn from their experience? Conversely, are there competitors of yours that have done this poorly? And if so, what can you learn from those mistakes? So that's where I would start. And then, there's a litany of resources beyond just my book. I would certainly take a look at Edison Research. Some of those citations are in my book, but I would look at some of their ongoing research about consumption and demand as it relates to podcasting. I would look at those reports, which are often readily available for free. If you just Google Edison Research's research in their latest reports, you'll be able to find gobs of data there. So I think there's no shortage of resources. It's just whether or not we're willing to take a piece here, a piece there, and put it all together into our own particular puzzle.
I think that's all fantastic advice. And it's a good way to go about it is to, you mentioned Russell Brunson earlier. It's kind of like what we refer to as funnel hacking. You go and look at what other people are doing and try to figure out how you can apply it. So I think that's fantastic advice. One last question for you. And that's, if you could give the listeners who are prospective thought leaders, people trying to build their business and build their platform, one piece of advice on how to improve their business, what would it be?
Gosh. Okay. So this might sound kind of anti-podcasting since we've just been sort of talking about podcasting for a while, but I think it's maybe 3 things. First thing is to get really, really clear on your point of view. It doesn't matter what platform we're talking about. It could be podcasting. It could be a video series. It doesn't matter. But get really, really clear on your point of view. And what I mean by that is, what do you believe in? What are you willing to pound a stake in the dirt and say, this is what we do here? Like your point of view, what you stand for, so that your prospects and customers can say, yeah, what Bobby said the other, like I totally get that. And it resonated with me. So what is your point of view? Second thing is, how are you going to consistently build cornerstone content around that point of view? It could be a podcast. It could be books. It could be quarterly webinars. It could be articles. It could be a litany of things, a video series. It doesn't matter. But if you're not building cornerstone content that consistently delivers your thought leadership, that goes back to your point of view to your audience, it is a huge miss. And in today's world, that is an ante to be successful. You have to be doing that in today's economy to be relevant. So if you don't have your point of view that is clearly mapped out in your mind, and you're not consistently building cornerstone content around your thought leadership that communicates your point of view, you won't have an opportunity to monetize. That's how critical this is. So I would suggest that your listeners get really clear on their point of view, and then get really clear on how they're going to create cornerstone content around that point of view. And then that ties into monetization later. But they have to get those first two pieces correct, or it's a big miss.
Wow, that is great advice. And thanks for all the advice you've given about podcasting, but also about that. Stephen, where can my listeners get in touch with you if they want to find out more information about what you do and how you might be able to serve them?
You can find us at predictiveroi.com, and right there you'll learn more about our core business, Predictive ROI, but also you'll find all of our episodes for Onward Nation. You can certainly look me up on LinkedIn. A book is just about anywhere that sells books. It's called Profitable Podcasting. And then, I love questions. So feel free to drop me a line if and when I could be helpful. And please know I'm certainly game to do that.
Well, thank you very much for being on. That's it for now. Listeners, make sure to stay tuned for a quick legal lesson after the break that I'm going to be talking about what you need to do to make sure you can actually monetize your podcast and use it and slice it and dice it, how Stephen has talked about.
And now for today's legal lesson.
Yay! That was some great advice that Stephen gave, and I love that interview. Obviously, look, I like podcasting. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it, and I started building my online career or my online presence actually in a large part by appearing on podcasts. So I love the whole concept of podcasting. And one of the things that really came through to me in Stephen's interview, and I think that you need to understand, is that the value that you get from podcasting, the way you're ultimately going to monetize it and get the most return on it, isn't going to be strictly from the podcast itself. And you might use his model of bring on people you want to be your clients, etc., and that works. But did you notice one of the things he talked about is you're going to want to slice and dice and use the content from your podcast in a lot of different ways. Maybe you're going to do it to use some kind of other content. Maybe it's going to be written content. Maybe it's a book or whatever, but you are going to use that content in a lot of different ways. And that's where I want to focus our attention for this legal lesson, because that's an issue that it's a mistake I see online entrepreneurs make on a regular basis. And the mistake they make is that they don't get the permission they need to be able to do that. Now, is someone going to come after them? Maybe not. But from a technical legal perspective, and to make sure that you're protected, you need to get permission from your guests to make sure that you can do that. Now, you might be saying, well, why? They appeared on my show. And that's right. But there is a concept in the law called the right to publicity or personality rights. This is the doctrine that allows celebrities to get paid for their endorsements or anything like that. But the notion of it at a basic level is that every person, celebrity and not, has the right to control how their name, image, and likeness are used for a commercial purpose. Some states have much more extensive protections, but those three things, name, image, and likeness, are protected everywhere in every state. So what that means is I can't use someone else's name or their likeness or any of that to promote my business without permission from that person. So let's talk about how that fits into a podcast. Now, some states have rules that say you have to have express written agreements. Realistically, though, there's a question. If someone voluntarily comes on and appears on your podcast, the whole purpose of which is for you to put it out into the world, they're going to have a hard time arguing that you have to take down your podcast after it goes live. Now, if they don't like the way they sound or something like that, maybe they're going to make the argument, but they'll have a tough time. But the problem is that if you don't have an express document that gives you permission to use their name, image, and likeness for other purposes, they could reasonably argue and say, no, I didn't give you permission to create a lead magnet with my words, or to use what I said in a book, or any of the other ways that you might slice and dice that content to get value. And so you need to get a written waiver or written release before the interview occurs. Now, there are these things out there that you can find. You can find written releases a lot of different places, and a lot of them will have very complicated language. Some of them are pages long. It's the kind of thing that you would sign, for example, if you were going to go appear on a TV show or anything like that. But I'm in favor of simplicity, and you don't want to have to send one of those documents to someone who's going to appear on your show. And in all the shows I've appeared on, I've never been asked to sign one of those. And I don't ask people to sign one of those. What I do ask them to do, though, however, is in my scheduling software. So I use Acuity Scheduling to do my scheduling. And, actually, I'm going to have a great episode coming up soon where we're going to have the founder of Acuity who's going to talk about that product. But the point is that in scheduling their interview with me, at the bottom, before they are allowed to say yes, they have to check a box that's next to something that says, I hereby consent to be recorded, waive any claim to publicity or privacy, assign all intellectual property in the recording to Your Online Genius, LLC, and allow Your Online Genius to use the recordings for all legal purposes. So what I'm doing is getting a written waiver and release of publicity rights and all other intellectual property rights in the recording before it even takes place. So that way I can use that recording, I can use that content however I want because I've already gotten their permission to do so. So if you decide to go down the route of a podcast, you need to have something similar to that. But I want to make this point a bit broader. Even if you decide not to go with a podcast, you need language like that for any time you're going to have anyone as a guest on fill in the blank. If you have a blog and you have guest bloggers, you should have them agree to something similar. If you're going to have testimonials, you need to get a release from those as well. But the point is, anytime you're going to do it, you need some level of protection to make sure that you're allowed to use their name, their image, and their likeness for any purpose. So just keep that as a rule and make sure that you're thinking that. So that's it for today. The point is, make sure you get a waiver or release of publicity rights before you do something so that you can make maximum use and get maximum value out of any guest who appears on your platform in any way. Now, that's the end for today. I actually want to tell you, if you're interested in podcasting, but maybe you think, hey, I don't want to actually, launch a podcast, stick around for next week, because next week we're going to have a show about the other side. And that's about the value of being a guest on podcasts as a way to build your audience and build your platform. So we've got a great guest for that. So that's going to be next week's show. So I hope you'll stick around. That's it for today. Again, my call to action, if you're enjoying the show, please go ahead and give us a rating and review. That will help to make sure that other people find the show as well. And also, if you're so inclined, I'd love it if you'd share it on social media. Just get it out there so that more and more people are able to find the show. That's it for today. I'm Bobby Klink, signing off.
Thanks for listening. And remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.